As an international trade advisor, I spend a massive amount of my time hunting for hidden asymmetries in global markets. I'm talking about those quiet, under-the-radar structural differences that suddenly decide the fate of entire nations when a crisis actually hits. And right now, there is a colossal asymmetry hiding in plain sight within the global food crisis. While the rest of the world is desperately scrambling for fertilizer, China is sitting pretty safely behind a massive wall. And that wall? Well, it's literally made of coal.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a high-stakes briefing on what I like to call China's Fertilizer Fortress. We're going to examine this incredibly unique, highly insulated market position that frankly gives Beijing immense global power. We're talking about the deep geopolitics of coal, ammonia, and how the very essential nutrients that grow our food are being transformed into a high-leverage tool of global diplomacy.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at the global supply shock, then we'll break down China's coal advantage, look into the export restrictions, analyze their diplomatic leverage, and finally, we'll wrap up by confronting the climate paradox.
Okay, let's jump right into part one, the global supply shock, a system starved.
So globally speaking, the entire fertilizer industry is just overwhelmingly dependent on natural gas, specifically gas from the Persian Gulf, as its primary feedstock. When the Hormuz maritime choke point closed, the cascading failures we saw were they were devastating. This wasn't just a typical price spike. We were watching a physical system collapse in real time. India literally had to shut down plants entirely, Bangladesh essentially went dark, Pakistan had to drastically cut output, and producers over in Europe, they were forced to reduce their operations down to bare minimum capacity. The world's agricultural foundation was quite literally starving because the natural gas just stopped flowing.
Now, let's move on to part two. China's coal advantage, the hidden asymmetry.
The contrast between the highly vulnerable global system and China's deeply insulated infrastructure is absolutely wild. The dominant global method relies on cracking methane, or natural gas, to get the hydrogen needed to make ammonia. But China? They built their entire nitrogen fertilizer industry on a totally different method called coal gasification. Actually, a massive 70 to 80% of Chinese ammonia production is completely coal-based. So while the rest of the world was heavily hooked on Gulf gas, China was busy building a system that relies on the one fossil fuel it happens to have in absolute abundance.
Let's break down how this actually works technically, because it's pretty fascinating. To completely bypass the need for maritime natural gas, you start by heating coal with steam and oxygen. Doing this produces something called syngas, which is essentially a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. And then finally, you process that syngas to extract the pure hydrogen you need for ammonia synthesis. It is a completely different supply chain, and the genius of it, from a trade perspective, is that practically none of it requires a ship passing through a highly contested strait.
To put the scale of this into perspective, we need to talk about a really staggering number: 4.85 billion tons. That is China's massive annual domestic coal production. They literally have centuries of proven reserves sitting there. Because of this, their ammonia production, which is estimated to be around 50 to 55 million tons per year, just runs reliably on domestic coal, completely regardless of what chaos is happening over in the Middle East. While plants in India and Europe were shutting down, Chinese ammonia plants just kept humming along. Their 1.4 billion people are going to have adequate fertilizer no matter what.
In my line of work, we throw around this term a lot: structural advantage. It basically means you have a foundational difference in your supply chain that completely insulates your market from external shocks. Producing over 50 million tons of ammonia domestically from coal makes China virtually immune to any Persian Gulf disruptions. Honestly, it's the ultimate structural advantage in today's volatile commodity markets.
Moving on to part three, the export restrictions, a market blackout. So tracking the timeline here is really crucial. Back in October 2025, which was actually months before the Iran war even escalated, Beijing imposed export restrictions on key fertilizers, specifically things like diammonium phosphate, or DAP, and urea. Now, they did this to ensure adequate domestic supply for their own farmers, which, politically speaking, is a highly rational move. Famine prevention is absolutely paramount in Chinese political culture. Then, in December 2025, they extended those restrictions, and currently, they're set to run through August 2026. The timing might have been coincidental, but the effect? Total devastation for the global market. You have the world's second-largest fertilizer producer actively hoarding its output, right while the rest of the planet is desperately starving for those exact nutrients.
And the real-world impact of this policy is just staggering.
Take Africa's urea imports in 2024 as a prime example. A massive 56% of those imports came directly from China. China was literally Africa's third largest fertilizer supplier. But with those exports now restricted, highly dependent markets like those across Africa lost their major backup supplier at the exact same moment those Gulf natural gas exports vanished. We saw the two largest fertilizer supply systems in the entire world constrained simultaneously, one by war and the other by pure domestic policy.
Which brings us perfectly to part 4, diplomatic leverage, the fertilizer playbook.
Now I want you to imagine this scenario. Say an African, South Asian, or Latin American country is facing an absolutely devastating fertilizer crisis. Their crops are basically guaranteed to fail, the Gulf can't supply them, the US and Europe definitely don't produce enough extra to export, and Russia has massive sanctions complications. But China has an abundant running supply just sitting there. But they will only selectively lift those export restrictions if you're willing to play ball. That right there, that is leverage. It is a level of soft power that can literally reshape diplomatic alignments for an entire generation.
You see, China has a long documented history of using export controls as diplomatic tools. We've seen it with rare earths, we've seen it with semiconductors. Well, fertilizer is just the newest tool in the kit. If Beijing decides to selectively lift export restrictions for a few strategic partners, they can extract some major concessions. We're talking about securing favorable UN votes regarding the Iran conflict, or expanding participation in their Belt and Road Initiative, or just demanding general diplomatic alignment. Suddenly, a nation's basic access to food security becomes directly tied to their geopolitical compliance with Beijing.
And finally, let's look at part 5, the climate paradox, resilience over decarbonization. When you actually run the numbers, this paradox becomes incredibly clear. Making ammonia from coal is just incredibly dirty. To put it in perspective, gas-based ammonia produces about 1.5 to 2 tons of CO2 per ton of product. But coal-based ammonia, that produces 3 to 4 tons. It is literally twice as dirty. So when you multiply that by China's 50+ million tons of annual production, you're looking at 150 to 200 million tons of CO2 generated every single year. The really bitter irony here is that the exact method climate advocates spent years condemning as an absolute environmental disaster is suddenly the only method resilient enough to survive a major maritime choke point crisis.
The International Fertilizer Association recently noted what they very delicately call mixed decarbonization signals. And what that really translates to is that this global crisis is causing a massive structural shift backwards. Think about it. Climate policy originally pushed the world toward cleaner, gas-based fertilizer, right? But that made everyone hopelessly dependent on the cheapest gas in the Gulf. Then, the war punished that exact dependence. So now, desperate, vulnerable countries are actively exploring a return to coal gasification. They are deliberately delaying green regulations because they've realized that a highly resilient, dirty method is the only thing keeping the people fed. It's essentially a climate disaster disguised as a food security solution.
Ultimately, China is emerging from this global crisis with enhanced leverage, thoroughly demonstrated resilience, and a massive strategic asset that other countries can only access on Beijing's specific terms. It leaves us with a really painful trade-off to consider when we look at our modern supply chains. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this question to reflect on. In a true back-against-the-wall global crisis, does food security fundamentally trump our climate goals? Take a moment, really think about it, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks so much for joining me today, and make sure you keep your eyes open for those hidden asymmetries.